Thank you, everyone. Welcome. Good evening. I'm going to do a little presentation that's a bit different in method to Michael. I don't want to shout at you any louder or just make assertions about things. I think if we have a reasonable discussion, it's about sharing information so you can find out for yourself, you know. It doesn't really matter what my opinion is at the end or what Michael's opinion is at the end. But if we can present information and share information, you might be able to find out for yourself what's going on there. Now, methodologically, I think it's actually important to talk to Syrian people about what's going on and to get a perspective on the war that's been going on there. I didn't see much of that perspective from Michael. When I've heard him in the past, he thinks it's shameful to visit Syria. You might have seen that some of the media in this country has attacked me for visiting Syria. But here's Damascus today. This is just a couple of weeks ago. This is a city that still has over 4 million people, despite the war, despite the fact that there's probably 5 million refugees outside. Now, I don't want to look at Syria as another country by the perspective that Michael was taking to say, well, here's a Syrian, and this is what a Syrian says. Here's what my Syrian friend says, and here's what someone else says. There are sources of independent evidence, and by that I include admissions from the parties. When I say independent, I mean evidence from people that aren't directly involved in the conflict that we can look at. Because, of course, it is a controversy, and our media has been running a very pro-US line on it. And I want to introduce with that perspective. But first of all, here's really pretty much the only large part of populated Western Syria that is still under rule of the Al-Qaeda groups. And they're all linked to Al-Qaeda. And they say that openly, and they call themselves Mujahideen, you know. So the figures that Michael put up from some of the jihadist linked groups, you have to take with a grain of salt, basically. No one has good statistics on this at the moment. But there's Idlib at the moment. There's the girls in school in Idlib, a school created by a Saudi cleric called Al-Muhassini, who was in Aleppo, in East Aleppo, before Aleppo was liberated late last year. There's the signs they're putting up there against democracy because it's polytheism. And at the moment, because of the Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Turkey, the Muslim Brotherhood linked groups, the Arad al-Sham groups are signing up to these peace agreements, which means a type of surrender with some sort of privileges, basically, in Idlib at the moment. Most of the war's going on in the east at the moment. Now, what you've seen for a number of years, and there's another one looming, another chemical weapons false flag looming, and this is one of the things that motivated me to write this book, by the way, the false flag incidents that they were using back in 2012 and 2013. The only point of these huge scare stories that come out is to support the legitimacy of what is effectively an illegal war of aggression against this country. And it's an international conflict. It's an international conflict. There's over 80 countries involved. It's not a civil war. Our media has called them rebels, whether they come from Somalia or Saudi Arabia or Syria or anywhere else, or Australia. It's not a civil war. The International Commission of the Red Cross just changed their designation recently, only because Trump made those missile strikes there. But the only point of this type of propaganda war is so that there's this extreme pretext to cover up the fact that there's really a war of aggression going on there. They're not using defected weapons. The Syrians use Russian weapons. The other side uses American weapons. Overwhelmingly. There's some Israeli weapons, there's some other weapons. There are some Russian weapons being sold to them now through the NATO countries, but it's overwhelmingly American weapons. And I was in Palmyra after it was liberated for the first time, and I saw the shells that left behind by ISIS. They're American weapons they use. They don't even deny that. Michael says something differently, but the US doesn't even deny that. They said they got them by mistake and by accident, and they took over Iraqi supplies and so on, one thing and another. So that's why the focus on the Syrian president, to try and reduce it down to a single demon, a person you can demonize, and then say, there's no one else in there in Syria except Assad. What did Michael say? Most of them defected from the army. No, every family in Syria has lost soldiers fighting these groups that are overwhelmingly driven by religious sectarianism and mercenary paid by the Gulf states. Now that the money is drying up from Qatar, we see some of the changes as a result of that. But people still live in Syria. I heard Michael say a few weeks ago that no one's there in Aleppo. It's all flattened. It's all these flattened buildings. Well, yes, you can look at Syria. A lot of the cities have a lot of flattened buildings. But there are still over 17 million people living in Syria. And in Aleppo, yeah, our friend from Daraya who said there's no one in Daraya. Is that right? Yeah. How many people? How many people live in Daraa now? 5 million people have left Syria. 5 million people have left Syria. Well, come to the refugees. Here's Aleppo. Here's people that are reconstructing their church. They're reconstructing their church. See, 2012, 2015, 2017. People think Aleppo doesn't exist. Do you remember all the publicity about Aleppo last year? Save Aleppo, save Aleppo. It was huge. Amnesty International here was raising funds. They won't say what they did with them after Aleppo was liberated and those groups were kicked out into Turkey and Idlib. But 1.5 million people still live in Aleppo. And 100,000 people were living in that east pocket that was held by the Al-Qaeda groups. There is still well over between 1.5 and 2 million people living in Aleppo. Here they are. They're graduating as doctors. They're going to school. They're rebuilding some of those buildings with original stone. They're reopening factories. So this is what people live there in Aleppo. You might pretend that people don't live there. Michael said there's no one in Aleppo. No, there's more than 1.5 million people living in Aleppo now. And do you remember the last doctor in Aleppo stories? Remember that? Last doctor, the last pediatrician, all that sort of stuff? That was the last doctor in the Al-Qaeda held areas. But in most of Aleppo, they have hospitals and doctors. And have you heard of the Aleppo Medical Association? 4,000 members. 4,000 members. They have a website. They have a Facebook site. Did any of the Western media go and say, what's going on with your doctors there? They're still graduating them. These people don't exist for the extremists that want to destroy Syria as a state. Now, let's look at the big picture that Michael sidestepped until a little footnote at the end there. 10 years ago, the Bush administration, which had just carried out 2 invasions in the Middle East, announced the plans for a new Middle East. The new Middle East was a comprehensive plan to dominate the Middle East and North Africa, by the way, because, you know, as we know, Libya was part of this plan too. A general came out and said that their plans at the time of the invasion of Afghanistan were to take over 7 countries in 5 years. Condoleezza Rice spoke of the constructive chaos that was going on there. This hardly appears in the perspective that talks about Assad as being the new Hitler in the world and all that matters. We need a perspective to understand these political things. We need to understand what the big powers are doing and not push it to one side and make some selective quotes about things. Now, what happened between Bush and Obama? What happened between Bush and Obama? There were changes and there were continuities. Between Bush and Obama, we have a recreation of North American doctrine, exceptionalism. You know, that the US is the light on the hill to bring peace and democracy and things to everyone. This woman I put up here because she represents some interesting things that were going on there. She created this concept, or spoke of this concept of smart power, because there was a big reaction in the world against Bush, against the brutal, direct, in-your-face invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, on false pretext, remember, always on false pretext. Every war is carried out on false pretext. Now, Susan Nossel began as the Chief Operating Officer for Human Rights Watch, talking about the Middle East conflict. She went on to become a Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Organisations under Hillary Clinton at the US Department of State, and in 2012 she became the head of Amnesty International in the USA. So I say that because she creates this doctrine to say we want to get away from the Bush ideology of these invasions, but we'll do it in a smarter way. We'll do it in a different way. We'll keep the role of a foreign policy that would bolster US power and unite the world behind the US exceptionalism, but we'll do it in a different way. And we'll use those embedded organisations, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, to do it. So when Susan comes to her office in Amnesty International in 2012, after Afghanistan has been occupied militarily for 10 years, what does she do? She gets Amnesty to say, NATO, keep the progress going. You've militarily occupied this country and semi-destroyed Afghanistan. You've let these warlord extremists take over since the 1970s. And Amnesty, we support your occupation of this country in the name of the human rights for women and girls. This, by the way, was an afterthought of George W. Bush. There's a George W. Bush Foundation now that funds human rights in Afghanistan, having occupied the country and slaughtered people there. I say that because you see the close relationship between those US-based organisations and the US government and their new attempts to have humanitarian war. Humanitarian war, effectively liberal imperialism, which has a long history. It goes back to the 19th century. A lot of the key European liberals were very strongly in favour of colonisation. Here's what happened in the new Middle East in the last decade and a half. Really, there's been one war in the region. It's only been one war. It's not just about Syria. The problem is with Syria is that Syria resisted, and it resisted for a long time. You know Afghanistan was invaded under false pretexts. They were the false pretexts of there was a mandate from the UN Security Council to get the suspects for the atrocities in New York in 2001. What did they do? They destroyed the country. They didn't have a mandate to that. You know about the weapons of mass destruction of Saddam Hussein. You know what a fake that was. You know that they admitted it. George W. Bush laughs about it now. They don't care when the damage is done. With Gaddafi, they have admitted now that almost all the accusations against Gaddafi were false. There was not going to be he wasn't threatening any massacre of civilians. Amnesty International in France withdrew their accusations against Gaddafi after he was murdered and after the Syrian state was destroyed. The Libyan state was destroyed. Libya, the country with the highest living standards in Africa, the highest status of women in Africa, does that mean nothing? That's what happened in Libya. They tried it with Israel in 2006, the invasion of Lebanon. That failed because although they managed to kill over 1,000 Lebanese, they couldn't stand that 150 Israelis were killed, and they pulled out. They weren't able to disarm Hezbollah. What were they trying to do? They were trying to destroy the independent forces that were against Israel, that were supporting the physical resistance of Palestine, the so-called axis of resistance, Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah. They failed that with Hezbollah. With Iran, they tried to put it on its knees with this nuclear deal that went on for almost a decade. They failed, and Iran is stronger than it was before. Iran is now the strongest country in the region because they remember being dominated by the US for a generation, basically. And when the US lost Iran, in 1979, they created this Sunni Shia sectarian idea. It didn't exist. You look in Lebanon in the Civil War, there wasn't a Sunni Shia schism in Lebanon during the Civil War. It was Muslims against Christians at that time. It was a different thing. They destroyed Libya. They tried to destroy Syria, and they failed to destroy Syria. And they don't take failure very well. In the Vietnam War, they didn't take failure very well. That's why the war took a very long time to end. Let's turn to Syria. Of course, there was and still is a big political reform movement in Syria. There's the biggest rally in Hama in 2011, and there's a bigger rally in Damascus in 2011. There were a lot of people in the streets for political reform, and what do they want? They wanted an end to the Ba'ath monopoly. They wanted an end to the corruption in the Ba'ath monopoly system. They didn't like the secret police. Who does like the secret police? I spent 7 years in jail because of the secret police. I have good reasons not to like the secret police. But now the secret police in Syria are stronger than ever. Why? Because they feared infiltration by the Muslim Brotherhood and funded by Israel and the US. When the violence began, it wasn't those people that were shooting. None of these people here were shooting. There were Islamists embedded in those crowds that hijacked the reform rally system, and it wasn't a what does the independent witnesses say? It's not me saying it here. It came from some of those strong Christian voices. Why? Because Christians were one of the groups that was targeted at that time. The slogans which were reported in the Western media in April 2011, Eloise to the grave, Christians to Beirut. And the Christians, because they had a voice, they had a press, they had a media that they could be heard through, were reporting in April 2011 these genocidal slogans by those Free Army groups, in particular Farouk Brigade with their Jabhat al-Nusra supporters coming in through the north of Lebanon, basically. So this man was eventually murdered by Jabhat al-Nusra in Homs. He'd been in Syria for 40 years. He said it wasn't a popular uprising. There were people that came out of those crowds, took advantage of it, and carried out another Muslim Brotherhood insurrection like the one they carried out in Hama almost 30 years earlier on. There's the slogans repeated the genocidal slogans from April 2011. There's the Saudi rep admitting that they armed the Islamists in Dara in March 2011. And then a series of false flag massacres carried on to keep trying to demonise the Syrians, to say you can't defend your country. It's quite true that the Mukhabarat, the secret police, was feared, no doubt about it. I've got friends that were held by the secret police and charged and had to pay their way and get their way out of it. It's quite true the Syrian army has killed arrested terrorists too. They've committed war crimes. That's true too. It's quite true there's collateral damage. But there is no credible independent evidence, and I've investigated it, that they have targeted civilians or carried out chemical weapons attack. That is quite false, and one chapter in this book will give you chapter and verse of all the independent evidence on that. Some of them were exposed by Western media. For example, in Daraya, for example, there was a massacre of 245 people in 2012. And at first it was blamed on the government. Robert Fisk went in there and found out it was a prisoner exchange gone wrong. And he reported it in the anti-Syrian media. The anti-Syrian media reported a series of those in 2012. Let's have a look at the refugees. Let's have a look at the refugees and let's look at the independent evidence. And by independent, I mean here, these are people who carried out a survey in Germany that were anti-Syria, right? The Syria campaign, a Wall Street creation in New York, commissions a German academic and some of his Syrian collaborators in Berlin, and there's a lot of anti-government Syrians in Germany. There's a very big Syrian population in Germany. So they carried out this survey, and you may have seen this headline, 70% of refugees are fleeing Assad. You know, at first I didn't even bother to read the survey. Then I read the survey. Very, very interesting. First of all, there's no mention of Assad in the survey. Okay, they're talking about the Syrian army. Let's say, okay, the Syrian army means the same thing as Assad there, for that point. Now, what they did say was that this was 889 Syrians living in Germany. 70% said the Syrian army was responsible for the fighting, but 74% said the anti-government groups were responsible. You see, it didn't add up to 100. More said the anti-government groups were responsible. 74% of those people that they chose in Germany came from jihadist-held areas, which were being attacked by the Syrian army. 68% of them were young men. You know what the population of refugees is? It is pretty much 50-50, men and women, all age groups and so on. 68% of these were young men. 77% said they feared arrest by the Syrian army. 82% said they feared the anti-government armed groups. So this, in other words, more feared the jihadists than the Syrian army. This is a poll carried out by anti-Syrian government people. That's what I mean by independent evidence. This stuff exists. Here's more independent evidence. US DIA intelligence, August 2012. What did they say? First of all, extremists, this is in the middle of mid to late 2012, extremists are the major forces in the insurgency in Syria. What do they call them? The Salafist, the Muslim Brotherhood, and AQI. What's AQI? Al-Qaeda in Iraq, created by the Saudis to destabilize Iraq in 2006, more than 10 years ago. It became ISI, Islamic State in Iraq, right? They were driving it in 2012. The US knew it. The head of the DIA, then Michael Flynn, said it was a willful decision by Obama to send ISI into Syria and create ISIS. Now, what else do they say? That's exactly what the US and its allies want in order to weaken the Syrian regime. Of course it is. That's what imperialism does. It divides little people. It divides countries. It tries to carve them up and balkanize them. They did it with Sykes-Picot. They want to do it again even worse than Sykes-Picot. That's why they talk about slicing it up into sectarian groups, basically. Demonizing the enemy. The chemical weapons attacks, you know, the one that they're talking about happening, Trump is predicting it now. Everyone that I know seems to believe this is giving a green light to the Al-Qaeda groups to do it again. The one in Khan Sheikhoun, they were very similar in the MO to the one in East Ghouta in August 2013. What was happening then? The Syrian government had invited UN chemical weapons inspectors to investigate a chemical weapons incident by Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, in Aleppo. As soon as that outfit got to Damascus, invited by the government, the ones in northeastern countryside made this attack and blamed it on the government. You have independent evidence of that. You have a lot of independent evidence of that. It was totally discredited. Here's this guy, Ted Postol, who also spoke of the Khan Sheikhoun incident. He is hired by the Pentagon to be a forensic munitions person. He investigates these sorts of things for the Pentagon. You know, he's not pro-Syrian government. He said it was impossible for the Syrian army to have carried that out. They didn't have a base close enough to use those projectiles. And he said the same thing about Khan Sheikhoun in April this year, you know, the pretext for the missile attacks on that airbase in Homs, that there was no evidence that it came from a plane. It was detonated on the ground. So I won't go into the detail, but there is evidence there from independent sources. It's not me saying it rhetorically with some... Here's the one, remember Qatar's morgue photos? Now, a defector came out of Syria in early 2014, at the same time I was in Syria, and said, here's thousands of pictures of bodies. They're all opposition people tortured to death in Assad's jails. Okay, what do we know? We don't know his name. He was anonymous. Qatar paid him. They kept his identity secret and so on. He did indeed have photos from a morgue in Damascus, in a hospital in Damascus, but a morgue, a hospital morgue. A year later on, Human Rights Watch gets access to the whole file. We don't see the whole file with thousands of photos. We see a few dozen, basically, dead bodies. What do they say? They say the dead bodies, 45% of the dead bodies are soldiers and security forces or other victims of crime and car bombings. They ran the same headlines. They take it for granted you're not going to read to page 2 and 3 of their report to see this. And they said, we're going to focus on the first group that we believe were people killed in jail. So Human Rights Watch admit a year later on that almost half those people were on the other side. This is the sort of information we get fed. Then we know in 2014, ISIS comes along and the US has another pretext to be in the region, in Iraq and in Syria, and Australia went along, got involved in it. Australia's been involved in bombing Syrian soldiers there. Recently, they got NATO to get formally involved in the operation against ISIS, which is really a pretext for them to be in Iraq and Syria and try and keep their control of the region. The senior officials have admitted publicly, this again independent evidence, that their allies fund al-Qaeda, that Turkey and Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the UAE at one stage too fund. And they said because, what does Lindsey Graham say? They fund them because the Free Army couldn't fight Assad. They were trying to beat Assad. When that wouldn't happen, they funded these groups, backed by the Saudis. What about Assad? You know, the modus operandi to say, here's my Syrian friend, and I say 90% of Syrian people are against Assad. That's meaningless. It's meaningless to have some Syrian or 10 Syrians or 100 Syrians to say that sort of stuff. There are polls that have been done, there are elections that have been done. And the interesting thing here is the enemies of Syria. What about the polls the enemies did, right? A Turkish agency, TESEV, a Turkish agency in late 2011 says, how many of you support violent protest against the government? 5% said they supported. 5% by a Turkish agency said they support the government. 91% opposed violent protest against the government. Does that mean they opposed protest against the government? No. Lots of people were against the government. Lots of people were against the Ba'ath system. But did they support the violent attacks on soldiers and police and doctors and civilians? No, they were against it. And the Turkeys said that. Doha, Qatar said, should Assad go, should Assad stay at the end of 2011? Of course, Doha was already funding the Muslim Brotherhood groups against Syria. What a slim majority there from a group that was against Syria said Assad should stay. What else do you want? In 2012, what the Free Syrian Army commanders, 3 of them, reported as saying that most of the people in Aleppo, a mainly Sunni city, supported the government. They were informing on them to the government. A NATO consultant said 70% supported Bashar. They had the elections, a presidential election in 2014, the first competitive one in many, many years. There were 3 candidates. Bashar, of course, had an institutional advantage, but nevertheless, he got something like 70% of the vote. He got something like 70% of the vote. It was what the FSA was saying. It's what all of the enemies were saying, the same thing. That's what I'm saying. If you want to know who supports the government, who's against the government, listen to the Syrians. Don't listen to a few individual Syrians. Listen to all of the Syrians. No, an individual Syrian means nothing. It means nothing. I'm an Australian. Do I speak for Australians? No. Sorry. Now, Australia's role. I'm going to wrap up on this. Australia's role. Australia has been involved in directly bombing Syrian soldiers who were fighting ISIS. At the time they were fighting ISIS, 100 soldiers were killed. They were bombed for an hour. And the Prime Minister said, well, it was an accident. It's not going to happen again, basically. I don't think that's good enough. I think we have a responsibility to hold our own government, at least, accountable. We don't speak for the Syrians. We don't speak for the US. We can decide not to be US's poodle in these sorts of things, but it's a total fake that they're fighting ISIS there. They're maintaining a conflict to keep their foot in the door. We also support economic sanctions against Syria. I mean, when I say Syria, I mean Syrians who live in Syria. They are hit by these economic sanctions. I don't mean people in exile who can say anything irresponsibly, say, go and attack my government, it doesn't matter, I'm not there anymore. The people that are there don't have access to essential medicines. We know what happened with Iraq. We know how many hundreds of thousands died because of the sanctions there. The World Health Organization, here's some more independent evidence, right, is saying that essential medicines are affected because the sanctions are so comprehensive. I know, I've been there, you can't draw money out of an ATM. Even in Cuba you can draw money out of an ATM, not in Syria. The sanctions are very powerful because the Europeans are involved with the US and the Australians are too. And I suggest we as Australians should tell our government to drop those sanctions against Syria and drop participation in the war against Syria. Thank you.